Okay. So yeah, welcome. Thanks for showing up. This is the first time we're doing an Ri3D in this format. We've hosted two other Ri3Ds in the past 2 years, and we're really excited to host our third annual one. But this time, we typically have restricted it so it's just teams in Northern California, especially graduated alumni in particular. But this time around, we wanted to create a platform for discussion for not just teams in Northern California, right? But to hopefully get teams like across the world involved. So yeah, that's why we're having this format where we're going to have 3 one-hour sessions, one on each day of the Ri3D, and anyone can join in. It's kind of like an open platform for discussion. We'll share some of the ideas we have and some of the things that we've taken away from starting to think about what this game is all about, and hopefully we can just have a platform to share knowledge, not just based out of teams in California or Northern California, but really across the world. So yeah, on the future days, I think tomorrow or the following day after that, we're going to have some teams from China and potentially even some teams from the United Kingdom joining in. So yeah, should be good stuff. Just to introduce myself, my name's Arya. I'm one of the coaches here at Dublin Robotics ROBOLABS, and for my background, I've done VEX since I was in like the 5th grade. I'm currently a freshman at UC Berkeley, so I just finished my first year. So even though I can't compete anymore, I still get to interact with this community by being a mentor for the teams at ROBOLABS and interacting with so many teams at all the competitions that we participate in. So yeah, without further ado, that's all the introductions I have. I wanted to introduce Max, who is going to be the person who's going to be handling the rules and game analysis portion of this brainstorming session. So I'm just going to bring her.
Hi, I'm Max. I'm going to be a head rep for this season. I will be handling game analysis portions and an introduction to the game manual. If you do have any questions about anything that has been covered in the game manual or that hasn't been covered in the game manual, you can ask that in the chat and Alex will pass that along to me, or you can say it out loud and there's a chance I may hear you. I don't actually know how the speaker works in here. A few things that have come up already as Q&As and have been answered are the concern over double scoring, in which the offensive zone is clarified as also being part of the goal. So there was a concern that anything scored in the goal will qualify as 7 points, 5 points for being in the goal, and 2 points for being in the offensive zone. However, in the next game manual update, the GDC has confirmed that anything in the goal is only worth the 5 points, and they will be clarifying that in the next update.
All right, so what we first want to do is, of course, I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with the game, but just to go over it.
Hit me. That is interesting. And
If the try ball is on top of the net, it doesn't count.
Arya?
Yeah. So the question in the chat is from Team 4073B, and they're asking, if there is a try ball that lands on top of the nets, right? So I think we're set up on this field over here. So let's say. So the question was, if the try ball lands over there on top of that net, does it count? And to my understanding, I believe it does not count. And basically, if it lands there, a team's not supposed to try. Like the robots aren't supposed to really try to interact with the ball on top of the net, basically.
Yeah, the exact wording of SC3, which is where they are defining what is scored in the goal, specifies it has to be under the net by at least 2 corners.
So
So no, if it's on top of the net, it's not a goal.
Right. So the kind of
And
things
it's
that
also not scored in the offensive zone because it's not touching the foam tiles of the offensive zone.
right. So kind of the things that we realize, I'm sure everyone has their own opinions and thoughts when the game dropped. But some of the things that we realize is that there's somewhat of like a parallel in a way to like Starstruck, for example, where you have this component of throwing game elements back and forth across the field, right? Of course, the Starstruck game elements, that's the game from 2017, I believe. And of course, the game elements, there's two different types of game elements. There's like these stars and then also like the cube, right? And those are much bigger in scale compared to the tri-ball, which is much smaller, right? At the same time, the aspect of throwing it back and forth is there. The only difference is in Starstruck, immediately once you throw it over, you'll try to throw it back over. Versus in this game, what you're really trying to do is go to the opponent's side of the field, throw the game element back over to your side, and then lock it into your goal. So some of the biggest takeaways that we realize that we have to focus on is finding an easy and efficient way to essentially go to the match loading station, right, and then pick up these game elements and throw them across onto the other side of the field. So in particular, some of the common mechanisms to do so would be typically when you have a throwing game, there's a catapult or a puncher or a flywheel. Those are pretty much the most straightforward options for kind of propulsion mechanisms to throw the tri-balls across the court, right?
But that's mainly going to be a focus on getting it over the barrier in the center.
Right.
The ability to throw it into the net is going to be a little bit more questionable because, as noted, this tri-ball from one tip to the other side, directly across, it is 0.4 inches taller than the actual height of the field tiles to the low beam on the goal. So the ability to get it in underneath that bar based on a throw is going to be more challenging and require a lot more accuracy.
Yeah.
So I'm at least expecting to see a bit more throwing to get into the offensive zone and potentially shoving to get into the goal itself.
Yeah, that's one of the things, there was a lot of talk at Worlds and even after, like if you go on YouTube, you might see these videos of teams who are trying to, cross-court throw it directly into the goal. And as of now, there's no definitive video that has been posted on YouTube with a mechanism that's been shown in the video of how you can actually do that. It's speculated that if you maybe throw it in with enough force, you can. But realistically, I think the way the game was designed was this is really a collaborative game. It's not just something that one team alone can do. If you were to pick up each ball and then go through the canal on each side of the field, right? So not even drive over the black PVC pipe in the middle, it would take you a really long time to go pick up your game element, go through the canal, and then go to the goal and then pop this under, right? So really, I think the whole rationale of the game is you have one robot who's kind of like catching all of these, the game elements that are thrown across the field, and you have one person who's just constantly throwing them over. And that, it's just kind of, it's almost like a game of catch, right?
Which does tie into their double zoning policy, in which the robots are going to be actively encouraged to stay on the opposite sides of the field. Because once they're both in one zone and not touching the barrier, then your opponent can take whatever they want out of your goal. Your goal is not protected when you are double zoning.
Yeah. So those are essentially, the different ways that we can actually throw these game elements across the field. There are some other variations, like I'm sure if you were following last season's competition, you might have been aware of the SCADA, which is essentially almost like a slingshot, right? So that mechanism is great because I think we'll switch to using the whiteboard here. But basically, let me bring the scores, and then that way you can listen as well. So we have a catapult already. So team 4073B is sharing that they already have a catapult built. So their strategy is to rapid fire all of the match loads across the field. So yeah, the catapult is definitely, I think early season there's going to be a lot of teams who are definitely using that mechanism, and I think it makes a lot of sense as well. Just to kind of like draw it out, right? So let's say you're going to have, one of the mechanisms that I mentioned was the SCADA, right? Which is essentially almost like you really have almost like an Angry Bird type slingshot, right? So you have this mechanism over here, and then the idea is that you pull this band back, and you can load your game element in here. And when you release that rubber band, right, this just goes flying across the field. So the benefit of this is that it's pretty linear in terms of the direction you're pulling back, right? As opposed to like a catapult where you have like the arm here, right? On a catapult, you're basically throwing this kind of like arc shape, right? So it's overhand. Versus, a scata is much more like a puncher, for example. So I'll just enable the scata, and then catapult. And then, of course, one of the things we talked about was like a puncher, right? So that's kind of in the same category as like the scata mechanism, where you're really just like in a linear direction, you're applying a force, and it goes in that. It'll, of course, still travel in an arc, right? But it's much less so than a catapult, right? So just to draw that out, right? That's just. Typically, the way a linear slide, puncher works is that you have a sprocket, or you have a gear over here, right? And then you have a rack with teeth on it. And basically, what happens is part of this gear is shaved, so there's no teeth on it, right? So when you pull back this arm, it'll pull back until this point right here, where there's a part where there's no teeth actually contacting this rack, and then this will slide forward and just punch your game element across the field, right? So that's the difference between like a catapult and a scata. And of course, I'm sure teams are familiar with flywheels. They saw last year's game. But essentially, the idea of a flywheel is you just have, some object that's spinning really fast, right? And those of you who have taken maybe some basic like physics classes or anything like that, you'll know what kinetic energy is, right? So it's a type of energy. And essentially, the formula for that is 1/2 mv squared. And what happens essentially when you have a flywheel is you have an object that's spinning really, really, really fast, right? And when you have your game element contact that object that's spinning really, really, really fast, the kinetic energy from the flywheel is imparted onto the game element, and it's kind of propelled across the field, right? So that's really, honestly, the flywheel is a really good mechanism where you have a situation where you can continuously fire, right? So one thing that we've been thinking about is whether we can make some sort of flywheel mechanism to shoot, the match loads across the field. Just because the way the match loading station works is that your robot only needs to be touching the PVC pipe that's colored, right? And once it is, you can load these one by one into your mechanism and then rapid fire shoot them across the field. So that's one of the ideas that we have for our Ri3D robot, is to build like a flywheel mechanism that essentially shoots these game elements across the field.
So for the question of arc versus more linear motion that was asked, the big concern is just going to be these are an irregularly shaped object, as they are, you can see, sort of triangular. They bounce in unexpected and unpredictable ways often. So the question about how much you're going to arc and how much strength you're going to want to put into a throw is going to come down a bit to how elements are returned to the field in the event that they do go out.
Right.
Most history with Vex is that refs are going to try and return as quickly and as much as possible because we do not want to see game elements removed from play. We want all game elements to remain in play so that teams can continue to play. But of course, that does mean if we're running after things, we're not seeing. If we're running after things, it takes us some time to get them back.
Right. One of the other aspects to consider about which shooting mechanism you're choosing is that, of course, there's other robots that are on the field, right? So if I'm a very fast shooter robot, right? If I can cycle these match loads across the field in like a matter of seconds, what I would think as your opponent is, how can I slow you down, right? So either the way to slow them down is by playing defense on them, right? So you're technically not allowed to grapple on any game elements, right? So for example, this is the PVC pipe that's colored where the match loading station is. You can't grab onto it with like a pneumatic clamp or something. That's against the rules. So if I wanted to stop you, right, I might play defense on your drive and try to push you away from the loading station or mess up your angle so you're not shooting perfectly into the right in front of the goal for your alliance to push it in, right? The other aspect and way that I could block your shot is by literally standing in front of your catapult mechanism or standing in the trajectory of your catapult mechanism or your shooter mechanism, right? So, for example, we have this is like the loading station over here, right? Where your robot is, and then you're trying to shoot it across the court to the other side over here, right? If I realize that this is your trajectory that you're shooting at every single time, and you're shooting at a really low angle, that means what I can do is I can just have my robot stand in front of your shooter and then block your shots, right? So going back to the conversation of, do you want something that arcs it a little bit, or do you just want that kind of linear motion? It really depends if you think that defense is going to play a big role in this year's competition, right? Like, what I foresee is that in terms of cycling these over, actually making a mechanism that shoots these over is not that difficult. These aren't very heavy game elements, right? But what will be difficult, I think, will be the defense that teams are playing on robots that are trying to cycle these over, right? You can really only win the match if you're able to get all of these game elements into play. So if you're able to shut down your opponent from even getting these onto the court, then you can essentially block them from getting the 20 or 22 game elements into their goal that they need to even be in consideration to win the match, right? So one of the ideas that we have for our Ri3D robot is to have some sort of pneumatic brake lock mechanism. So like I mentioned before, right, you're not able to, if this is a PVC pipe, you can't grapple onto it, but what you can do is you can have like a pneumatic brake clamp that essentially very similar to how, if you've ever looked at a car, a car wheel, for example, right? The way the braking system on cars work is that they have their wheel, right? And then next to their wheel, they have another wheel, and essentially they have like a clamping mechanism that grabs onto the wheel and then basically stops that wheel from rotating, right? So the rationale behind one of our Ri3D designs that we're thinking about is to have some sort of pneumatic brake locking mechanism, either that locks one of the wheels in place so that way you can't get pushed around, or another idea is to have some sort of clamp that essentially slams into the ground. So what that would look like is maybe like a sideways 4-bar, right? Because then you get this like arc motion that you get with like a 4-bar mechanism. So let's say this is the ground over here, and then this is the bottom of our platform where we have the locking mechanism. We can essentially just put anti-slip mat right there, and then have a piston that actuates this downwards into the ground. So in that way, then we can essentially lock into the ground, and then we can continuously cycle these game elements across the field without having to worry about someone playing defense on us. So that's one of the ideas we had for how to overcome defense, and I think that will definitely play a bigger role in the competition season as we progress. Let's see, we have a comment from Team 4073B. So what they said was, we were thinking of a horizontal scissor bar that extends 36 inches that defends the goal. However, we didn't want to because the defensive robots don't get the benefit of the doubt. It's kind of risky. Yeah, so of course, Vex is an offensive scoring game, and people who design robots that are being productive in scoring points are always going to get the bias, I guess, of the referees, right? This isn't to say that defense is a bad idea or you shouldn't do it, but in general, Vex games are designed to be offensive, and they always prefer the offensive scoring robot. So what I would imagine, as well as thinking about like a mechanism like a scissor bar lift, right? That's going to add a lot of weight to your robot as well. And this kind of segues into the part of the conversation that we wanted to have about hanging mechanisms. So everything that we design on the robot, whether it's how we shoot this, what the drive looks like, what the intake mechanism looks like, what we always have to keep in mind is like the weight of the robot. Just because this year there is a hanging aspect. So I think the last game that we had where you really had to hang on a bar or a pole or anything like that was Starstruck, so 2017. And in that year's game, you got, I believe, like 12 points for doing a high hang, essentially. So that's like elevating your robot past a certain height, right? But what we realized is by a lot of teams early season were developing these hanging mechanisms. But by the end of the season, if you were to watch like Worlds level highlights from Starstruck, you'd realize that no teams are really hanging during the Starstruck finals matches at Worlds. And the reason for that is because in that game, it just made more sense to keep on throwing the game elements back and forth, just because there's no way to score them and lock them into your goal, right? In this year's game, you have that aspect of like security and having confidence that whatever you score will stay scored, right? Because of course, once you put it into your goal, no one can de-score it unless you're double zoning. So that's one of the key differences between Starstruck and this year's game. So I do foresee that hanging will be a big part of this year's competition. I think early season, what we're going to see is a lot of teams are going to try to make hanging mechanisms, and it'll be all low hanging mechanisms, right? But by the end of the season, I think the teams that really differentiate themselves from like good and great teams will come down to the high hanging aspect, right? So again, weight is going to be a huge part in all the designs that we see and teams come up with. The lighter your robot is, the easier it's going to be for someone to hang. Okay. Right. Sure.
Well, for the motors used for elevation, last time I used a motor for elevation, we were still doing V4 motors, so those ones did function for elevation pretty easily.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, the question was, the motors have 3 different stopping types, right? They have brake, hold, and coast. So at the end of the match, you can set the motor to the hold mode, for example, or the brake mode. And basically what that does is if you have any experience with like PID controllers, PID controllers can be used for like motion, for example, right? So if you want to reach a certain position, you could just have a simple while loop, right? That is, while the encoder value is less than the target value, I'm just going to drive forward. And then once I reach that final encoder value, I'm going to turn off my motor, right? The issue with that is that robots have inertia and momentum, right? So, let's say we're driving forward with 100% speed and we hit our target and we turn off the motor, it's still going to roll forward a little bit, right? So that's the whole idea of like a PID control system, right? It's basically saying I have a target and I want to essentially go and land perfectly on my target value, right? As I approach my target, I'm going to slow down. So the same concept can be applied to holding a position as well. Let's say you want your motor to hold a position of like 45 degrees, right? Essentially, you can have a PID control system. If you really wanted to hard code it, right? You could have like a control system that basically keeps you at that 45 degrees, and it would apply motor force. So if you slip away from that 45 degrees, it would apply more force this way. If you slip away from the 45 degrees this way, you apply more force this way, right? So that's essentially the logic that's happening when you set the motor to hold versus brake, right? So coast, it doesn't apply any power, right? So that's why if you hang and you don't have like a locking mechanism or a high hang, then you would just fall down, right? Versus if you do have some sort of locking mechanism, then you could have it on coast. Or if you use the hold or brake functionality, depending on how heavy your robot is or what kind of mechanical advantage your system has, you maybe can just stay elevated with using the hold or brake. But the other option is you use some sort of mechanism like a locking mechanism. So yeah, exactly. So in the chat, team 4073B, they just shared about, can you use a ratchet for a locking mechanism? So you definitely can, right? So ratchets, for those of you who don't know, are essentially one-way. It's almost like a one-way door, right? It allows you to spin in one direction and then it'll lock up the other way, right? So this is typically used in a lot of motor sharing mechanisms. I think like the most famous examples are in like change up, for example. A lot of teams use ratchets for motor sharing, so that way they could have 2 motors that powered, 2 motors that were working together to do some functionalities. But at the same time, if you spin them in opposite directions, they can have different polarities. The downside of a ratchet is, like I mentioned before, it's like a one-way mechanism. So as opposed to like a differential, right? Let's say you have 2 motors that are hooked together in a differential. You get 2 directions of output that are each independent of each other. So I could power one mechanism in 2 ways, and I could power another mechanism in 2 ways as well. Versus with a ratchet, you can really only power it in one way. You can use 2 motors, and the other way you could only use 1 motor. But in terms of the implementation here, you could definitely find a way to use a ratchet for your locking mechanism. The only thing I'm thinking right now, I would have to like draw it out, of course. But like I mentioned before, ratchets are like one-way mechanisms. So there could be, depending on how you design your hanging mechanism, let's say you are using a ratchet, right? You might be able to only go up or only go down, for example, or only use 2 motors or 1 motor worth of power in one of those directions. That's like the main thing to think about. Just to draw it out. Oh yeah. So we had 2 teams that just joined in. So I have a team number for one of them. So team 1255D. Welcome. Glad that you guys could join us. And then one other person also joined our call. So I might be mispronouncing your name, so I apologize. Naim, Naim. So welcome to the call. I don't know which team number you're from. If you would like, you can add that to your username, and then that way we can, I can just like say your team number as well. But yeah, this is just to summarize, we went over some of the ways to throw the game elements over the field, and then we were starting to talk about the hanging aspect as well. So yeah, as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. Our audio system is set up so you can directly talk to us as well. But yeah, this is just a platform to kind of share some ideas and brainstorming, and what we're planning on doing with our Ri3D. Yeah. Yeah. I guess at this point we can kind of open the floor. Do any of you guys have questions that you'd like to talk about or address or get our input on? Yeah. Okay. So I have a question from team 4073B, and what they're asking about is, would a change-up style intake be viable in this year's competition? So I actually did compete in change-up. That's one of my favorite games, actually. Unfortunately, it was during the pandemic, right? So it was all virtual. But yeah, change-up is one of the games I have a ton of experience in. I was actually the division champion for the research division in change-up at Worlds. So I'm really super familiar with the change-up style intakes, and I definitely think they have some implementation that can be applied here. So in particular, right, the main benefit, for those of you who don't know what that is, essentially this change-up style intake is you have an arm on both sides, and then you have a wheel over here and a wheel over here, and these are both flex wheels. So the benefit of flex wheels as opposed to these kind of wheels, right, is that they're flexible, right? So the benefit is that they can conform and adjust to whatever game element you're working with. So in particular, when you're working with something like a tri-ball, right, which is a very irregularly, it's not a normal object, right? Like this is the first time I've ever seen an object this shaped. So I definitely think a change-up style intake could be beneficial here, especially because to a degree it also does follow some properties of a ball that are similar to how the change-up style intakes were designed for the balls that were in play in the change-up game. So I definitely think that could be a viable strategy here. In particular, intakes are really beneficial for when you're fielding and receiving, like tri-balls that are being thrown across the field, right? So majority of the game elements are going to be introduced through the match loading station. And at the match loading station, you can directly load onto your robot, right? So let's say you have, like a SCADA mechanism or like a puncher mechanism like we talked about before, right? If you're touching the bar at the match loading station, you can directly load it into the puncher, or you can directly load it into the SCADA or the flywheel, or whatever mechanism you're using, right? So I don't really think you would need an intake mechanism for the match loading station, right? What you really need the intaking mechanism for is when you're fielding those initial tri-balls that are on the field, as well as for receiving shots that are thrown across the field, right? And also for like packing these tri-balls into the goal. I think, Max, you might know, but how many tri-balls can you fit under the net, like reasonably?
Somebody has actually managed to shove every single one under one goal.
Oh wow.
But they were not able to do that with a robot or legally in any way. Personally, I tried shoving a whole bunch in from the sides, and I got to about 35 before it started to become unreasonable.
Okay.
But somebody could probably beat that. That might be on the low end.
Sure. So yeah, like Max mentioned, right? You can fit like maybe 30 to 35 on the low end, but maybe you can fit even more, right? So when we're thinking about,
you can sort of see behind us. They seem to be testing the theory now.
That's right. So when we think about all of these game elements, our robot needs to be able to put these up and then push them into the goal with a certain amount of force. It's not super easy to fit these under the bar. Of course, you can have your drivetrain kind of help you push it under. But when it gets to these really high numbers, like 30, 35, you might want like a powered mechanism that helps give it that extra push into the goal. So, one of the things that we've talked about is the change-up style intake. One of the benefits is that you can really push and apply a good amount of force onto the game elements and really lock them into the scoring zone. So yeah, I think the change-up style intake could have some merit here, and we're definitely going to prototype that. The only other thing I forgot to mention on these kind of intakes as well is essentially you have a pivot point right here and a pivot point right here, and there's rubber bands that apply an inward force like this. So the reason we have that on pivots and banding inward is so that way we can apply a compression onto the ball, right? Or in this case, a tri-ball. So the benefit of that is when you have, the flexible flex roller intakes as well as compression being applied like this, you have a lot of force that's being acted on this tri-ball. So when you push this out of your robot into the scoring zone, into the net, you can definitely apply a lot of force into it, and you can really push it pretty far into the goal. So I think change-up style intake could be pretty beneficial, especially as we get later and later into the season and we try to pack more game elements into the goal. I can definitely see merit in that kind of style of intake.
Okay, one thing that I'm going to throw out there, because the guys just did shove a whole bunch of tri-balls in the net, and I thought and it made an excellent opportunity for me to remind everybody of this one. Alliance tri-balls, they're covered under SC5, or scoring rule number 5. Those will always count towards the score of the Alliance with their matching color. So if you look down into the little screen in the corner with the goal, you see that there are 2 blue tri-balls in the red goal right now. Those are in the red goal, but you will get those 5 points, well, 10 points, because those 10 points of the 2 scored in the red goal will always go to the blue Alliance, even if they're in the red goal. So I thought I'd throw that out there because that was a point of confusion for me, and a couple of other people have asked me about it.
Definitely. We have a question here from Marshall from team 1255B. So their question is, do you think having 2 claws on the side of the robot, 2 claws on the side of the robot, or having one right in the middle of the robot would be better for climbing? So I'm assuming that the claws you're talking about are for manipulating these game elements, right? Oh.
So are we talking 2 claws on, if we're looking down on this, are we talking 1 claw on side A and 1 claw on side B, or 2 claws on side A? And would those be stacked vertically on top of each other or horizontally next to each other? Because I'm not actually, the first one on either side? Okay. Okay.
So are the claws for tri-balls, or are the claws meant for climbing? My understanding is you're talking about for tri-balls, but correct us if we're wrong. For climbing the pole. Okay. So.
Okay, I can think of one way that this would work, and it's actually really cool.
How would that work?
I'm thinking you grab on with one and you lift yourself up, like, I'm not sure if I can draw this. I'm not good at drawing. You grab on and you lift yourself up so that your other one can grab on, and you can sort of under yourself up the pole.
I see.
Are you
seeing
what I'm thinking?
Like kind of doing like a cartwheel onto.
Yeah, cartwheel your way up.
So.
Because that would be really cool, and I'm not entirely positive about the mechanics of making that work.
So in terms of climbing, right, the ration, like the where I'm coming at it from is basically there are some past case studies that we can look at in terms of climbing mechanisms. So some of the most, what I would say some of the most successful ones, almost, and in recent history relatively, like I said, the last climbing game was 2017, so it's definitely been a hot minute since then. But in terms of the most recent ones, in Starstruck, what we saw was there was a lot of 4-bar climbing mechanisms, as well as linear slide climbing mechanisms and arm climbing mechanisms. So we can kind of go through each one. Just to familiarize you all with how climbing worked in Starstruck, there's essentially a PVC pipe right here, like so, and there was an opening. And what you were allowed to do in Starstruck was you're allowed to have a mechanism that locks into the PVC pipe, right? So you can put a hook inside of it or anything like that, right? This year, we can't do that because if you notice on the field, right, each of these climbing poles have a yellow cap on top of it, right? So you can't lock into the goal.
The elevation bar cap,
Right.
which if you are touching, if you are in contact with the elevation bar cap, your elevation is worth nada.
Right. So you can't be touching the yellow cap on top. So that makes it so you really have to make some interesting climbing mechanisms that you can't just like use, the fact of, you can't really use the geometry of the pool in the same way to climb and hold yourself up there, right? So the way that we've thought about doing that is, one way is, of course, you have, let's say this is your robot, right? You have your gear right here, and then you have an arm that comes down. So this arm would have some sort of mechanism with probably like a one-way door. And essentially, you have this gear over here, and you have a smaller gear over here, and you'd be powering this one, right? So when you're powering the smaller gear, and then that smaller gear connects to a bigger gear, of course, you have a gear ratio for torque. So that's how, in combination with using like a torque internal, you're able to generate enough torque to really, essentially the idea with this like arm style design is you have this arm that starts here, it goes all the way back, and then let's just draw like a dotted arm over here, right? And then it locks into this pole somehow. And then what you can then do is you can have the arm spin in the opposite direction, and then what ends up happening is this whole robot does like a pull-up onto itself. And then that's one way to elevate, right? So that's one approach for the hanging mechanisms that we've considered. Another one that we've thought about.
One thing with that is locking is going to become really important because I know previously up to Starstruck there was a bit of a grace period for failure of your lift. If you lifted and you were holding there but there was some sort of issue with scoring and they were dragging it on and after maybe 4 or 5 minutes your lift mechanism failed because you ran out of power or whatever, there was some grace period, some wiggle room in still admitting your elevation, but they have yet to make any decrees about that for this game. You're definitely going to have to maintain it for some amount of time, but it might not be that it has to be an indefinite lift.
Yeah, so some of the things, like we talked about ratchets earlier, right? So maybe you could use a ratchet on that arm mechanism or have like a piston lock or something that kind of takes the pressure off the motors to keep you up in that elevated state, right? Of course, maybe if your robot's light enough and you use the brake type or the hold type on the climbing mechanisms, then you don't have to worry about that. But that is one way to approach it, right? So this arm style thing that locks in and then you do a pull up on to yourself, right? That probably, that's one way about going about it, and that's how a lot of teams did it in Starstruck. One of the other ways about going about it is you could have like a linear slide mechanism, right? So for example, let's say you have your linear slide track here, and then up here you have some housing, right? Here, let me step onto this side. So you have a housing up here, and then you have your motor, and then you have a pinion, and then you have this giant set of teeth, the linear tracks, right? And then all of these have teeth. So essentially the way this linear slide hanging mechanism works is that this motor spins and it would move the linear slide out, right? So now this slide mechanism is going out and out and out and out and out, and then you can reach the top of the goal, right? And then you would have some sort of locking mechanism either with like a pneumatic clamp or a gravity lock, and then it locks into the goal. And then you could spin this motor in the opposite direction and you'd basically pull yourself up the gear, right? So now this arm originally starts here, it extends out, and then the robot kind of climbs up onto its arm, and that's how it elevates itself. So that's one way that we see teams in Starstruck do a high hang climbing mechanism. One of the downsides of this is that it's pretty slow. I think Oscar mentioned in the chat earlier, climbing speed needs to be fast to be worth it. Even though in this year's game you can like lock and protect these game elements by putting them into your goal, unlike Starstruck, this, of course, at the end of the day, cycle time is everything. It doesn't matter how cool your robot is or whatever functionalities you have. If you can't cycle game elements as fast as you can, if you can't do the pull up as fast as you can, you're gonna lose, right? So cycle time is very important, and to have a fast hanging mechanism is very important as well. Did you have something to say?
Well, I just thought I'd give you a quick, brief overview of the elevation rules. For elevation, we are going to be using this handy little stick here, which probably you can't see, but if you get a feel, you'll see one of yourselves. It comes with all the little pre-marked A, B, C, D, E, F, yada, yada, yada. You can go up to J in your height. We will be measuring to the lowest point on your robot, and the area for the letter goal is going to be it's going to go up to the very top of the white line. So you're going to have to break the top of the white line to get into the next zone up. And if you manage to go higher than J, you're not going to get any additional points. The top that you can get to is J.
Right.
Elevation will not count if you're touching the field perimeter. If you're supported by the field perimeter, not an elevation. You're not elevated based on the elevation bars. As mentioned, if you are touching the yellow cap, not an elevation. Also, if you are lifted by another robot, if you are in contact with a robot that is contacting the field tiles, that's not a lift. That's not an elevation. You're being lifted by somebody, and therefore it's not going to count for points. And for those who are curious, I did double check. If you manage to lift yourself up and sort of ensure your lift by sitting on the horizontal section of the elevation bar, which is completely legal, that is approximately a D height. Maybe an E if you're... I'd have to paper test it, and I don't have a robot on hand.
Gotcha. Yeah, so like we were talking about hanging mechanisms. And basically what we need to do to...
What?
Okay. I don't know what that was. But anyways, so we have a comment from Oscar. So
yeah, I know my team never elevated, about how nobody in Star Trek elevated because it took time away from the end of the match. I know that my team personally never elevated when we were doing Star Trek because we used those final couple of seconds to score as much as possible, because it meant that our opponent couldn't score any of the things back to us.
Right. So in particular, even with my team, when we were competing in Starstruck, right?
You did Starstruck.
I did do Starstruck.
I thought you were still a child then.
That was my first VRC competition, Starstruck. And so I was in the middle school division, right? But even in the middle school division, what we saw was that it just didn't make sense in terms of timing to actually do a high hang. Because when you go and you elevate yourself, right, you're essentially losing one of the players on the field, right? One of the people that are going to be throwing these game elements back and forth. So even though you got 12 points from doing a high hang, right, what actually ended up happening was if a team's able to turn around and throw, I believe it was 6 stars into your far zone, or if they throw maybe like 2 cubes into your far zone or 3 cubes into your far zone, they could actually counter your high hang. So at that point, it actually made more sense to, until the end of the match, just keep going and throwing these back and forth. Just to say as well, there was an aspect in Star Trek that you can't lock these points away, right? In this game, you can lock away points by putting into your goal, but that's just something to think about.
Star Trek, you had no limit on possession, so if you could hoard all of the game elements and shoot them all at once. We did see a couple robots, Star Trek Worlds, that would shoot pretty much every single game element that they were able to get their hands on, so at least 50% of the field in the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's another thing that's a difference between Starstruck and this year's game, right? In Starstruck, you could hoard and you could carry multiple game elements at once. Here, there is a rule that says you can only carry one game element at a time, right? You can only carry one tri-ball at a time. So it doesn't really it's impossible to do some sort of hoarding, at least, manipulating multiple tri-balls at once and hoarding in a very deliberate way. It's pretty difficult to do something like that.
Also, with the scoring of the elevation in this version, it's not you get a flat score for elevating yourself. Whoever gets to the highest elevation point gets the most net score. That's 20 points. If both of your robots are in that top tier, it's 40 points for your side. But if you're all in the same tier with your opponent, if, for example, you all elevate yourself up to B, all 4 robots, that's 40 points to each side and a complete tie.
Yeah.
So the scoring of it is going to be different. Also, while the 20-point maximum that you can get would be equivalent to 4 tri-balls in the goal, it's going to be closer to, it's going to be 10 tri-balls in the offensive zone. So the ease and speed at which somebody could potentially score that much is limited in relation to how quickly you could rack up points in Starstruck.
Right. Yeah, that's 100% true. And one of the other things I wanted to touch upon as well is, the idea of like how many game elements are on the field, right? So a majority of the game elements that are going to be introduced are through the loading station, right? There's very few on the field, right? So that means each team, starts with like 22 game elements on each side, right, that they can put into play. And the remaining is just like a free-for-all, right? It's just on the field. So let's say all 22 game elements are secured, and it's like a guarantee, right? Like I get these 22 in my goal, and my opponent gets their 22 into their goal, right? The only thing that's going to differentiate you then is going to be how many of the free-floating game elements that are starting on the field that you capture, as well as your hanging mechanism, right? Who gets the highest hang possible? So in particular, 2 things. One is a lot of the hanging mechanisms that we talked about. Essentially, the issue with a lot of them right now is that, let's say, this hanging mechanism, it starts at the top of the robot, it goes all the way up, it locks onto the top of the goal here, and then you pull yourself up, right? The distance from here to the bottom of the robot is how much you're going to lose in terms of height, right? So the height of the robot is scored from the bottom of the ground up until the lowest point on the robot that's elevated, right? So, for example, with a mechanism like this, right, our robot would get elevated to like here, right? So the bottom of the robot would be there. So your hanging height would only be from the bottom of the goal up to there, so the bottom of your robot, right? So what you really have to think about is, of course, early season, any hanging mechanism will be good enough. That's what I'm guessing, right? Like early season competition is really just about consistency, reliability, and repeatability, right? So if you're able to consistently hang and even get up to that height, that's going to be really good early season. But late season, I think some teams are going to try to find like pretty interesting ways of getting it to the bottom of the robot itself is like all the way up here, right? So then that way, really your hanging height is all of that. That's going to be one of the way teams differentiate themselves, right? That's what's going to differentiate the good teams from the great teams. The other aspect,
since maximizing your score there is not about maximizing your height. You just have to be higher than your opponent to get the highest score possible. So you don't have to be at the highest level.
Yeah. You just have to be better than your opponent to get the points, right? So teams who really make it a competitive goal and one of their core competencies in terms of their robot designs to hang will definitely have that additional benefit. That's going to be a pretty big point swing. It's like a guaranteed at minimum 5 points more than your opponent. Biggest case, maybe 20 points more than your opponent, right? If none of them hang. So hanging is one of those deal breakers. It's going to be one of those things that really turns the tides of the match. The other thing that's going to change the tides of the match is who gets the free-floating game elements that are on the field, right? So like we mentioned, there's 22 inside the goal and then 22...
The one final thing on elevation?
Yeah.
One final thing on elevation is going to come into play is how much of the elevation bar your robot itself is taking up to elevate, because you can get elevation points for both robots on your alliance. But if your robot uses the elevation pole so much that there's no way for an alliance robot to also elevate, then you're cheating yourself out of potentially 20 points. So that'll also come into play in strategy and alliance selection, figuring out which other robots can hang, given that you're also hanging. Because you're both going to want to hang, and there's only so much space on that pole.
Yeah, that's actually a really important factor. Ideally, your hanging mechanism has a pretty low profile in terms of how much of the actual PVC pipe that it's holding onto, which is why something maybe like a gravity lock would be better than like a giant pneumatic clamp that holds onto the goal, right? Because then that way your alliance partner can't hold onto it as well. but going back to that aspect of, there's only a finite number of tri-balls on the field, I think especially late season, just how in, tipping point, there was like the goal rush where everyone was rushing to get like, whoever got 2 out of 3 of the neutral tipping point goals would basically win the match, right? As long as they don't mess up. If you get those, you're set, right? So there could be an aspect in this year's game as well, because each team gets 22, and ideally both of those 22 that you load into the field are guaranteed. It's all going to come down to the hanging aspect, which we talked about, and who gets more of those free-floating game elements. So there could be, somewhat of a goal rush in a way, except with tri-balls, right? So I could maybe see people making, mechanisms that, hover over onto the other side of the field and kind of knock the tri-balls over onto their side of the field, even in Auton, right? So then that way you're able to secure possession of more tri-balls, right? Whoever has tri-ball control and, has the majority of the tri-balls on their side of the field in their goal, they're the ones who are going to win the match at the end of the day. So yeah, it's really looking to the late season, right?
Are they?
I mean, it's really, the only difference is going to be...
Both of your opponent robots elevate to the highest point, that's 40 points. That's what?
But if you elevate to the second highest thing, then you have how many points?
Both of your robots, that's 30 points.
Right. So at that point, the difference is only 10 points. So it is going to come down to whoever has more tri-balls, right?
But I wouldn't recommend relying. So you are going to have to hang towards the end of the season. I wouldn't recommend relying solely on the tri-balls, because to get that 40 points, that's what, 10 tri-balls in a
No, what I'm saying is you shouldn't give up on hanging, or you shouldn't give up on tri-balls or anything. A good robot is going to be
This is going to be a game where you got to have to do it all.
Yeah, your robot should be able to do all of it, right? So in addition to hanging and ideally getting the highest hang possible, it's good. I think a very large factor is going to be who has tri-ball possession, right? Who has the majority of those on their side of the field. Because at the end of the day, at Worlds or even at state level competitions or maybe in regional finals, all of the tri-balls on the field are going to be cleared, right? Each one of these goals can take, 35 to maybe 40 tri-balls under the net, and I think teams are going to try to maximize that. So it's really going to come down to whoever has majority of these on their side of the field and whoever gets the highest hang. So those are the two. The order qualifier, right, is you get your 22 onto your side of the field into your goal, but the order winner is going to be whoever gets the majority of them onto that section, whether it's in the remaining free-floating ones into your goal or getting the highest hang possible. I think we have just a few more minutes, right? Or I think we're pretty much wrapping up. Yeah, definitely. You can unmute and ask your question, please.
It might help if you type it. It's loud in here. Because I can't hear anything.
Yeah. You can feel free to ask your question. Yes, we can hear you.
Sorta.
Go ahead.
Basically, I did a prototype to change on the tape.
Okay.
And we have two flex wheels, 2 4-inch flex wheels, so I was going to put one on each side. And I had 2 flex wheels for both of these, but it kept jamming. I think the reason why is because this 2 flex wheel was very now. So would it be okay if I use Omni wheels instead of this and put it
I see. Here, 1 second. Let me pin the. 1 second. Let me see. Okay, so yeah, I'm only able to see your mechanism right now. So basically, you have a 4-inch flex wheel that links by chain to a 2-inch flex wheel, and your issue is that it's jamming.
Yeah, I think the reason why is because the 2-inch flex wheel is broken out because they're not linear.
Right.
Like sideways together.
Yeah.
So it would be possible to just use an Omni wheel instead of a flex wheel on one of those.
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot of teams that, me included, I did use an Omni wheel as well in replacement of a flex wheel. I used it early season, and then for late season, I switched to a flex wheel. But I definitely think that an Omni wheel could work as well. The only thing is you have to, I think there might be a little bit more tuning involved just because it doesn't compress as much, right? So you have to be much more deliberate with the placement of the wheels and making sure, you're lining up the distance the two wheels are away with where you want to contact the tri-ball and everything. It matters a little bit more because the Omni wheels aren't compliant like flex wheels, right? But that could definitely work.
Alright, thank you.
You could also theoretically sprocket and rubber bands.
And it's great to, this is really why we have this platform, right? So, teams can show off what they're working on. We're going to work on our Ri3D and we're going to share it with all of you guys. So yeah, I think you have a great start on your robot, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it progresses and develops.
I already have the directory and how it's like a prototype. Let me go grab it. Well, we have enough time.
Well, yeah, you could definitely bring it. Yeah, we can hang back a few more minutes. Yeah, go for it.
Must the children be here during all of this?
Yeah. Our facility is in full swing right now with everyone working on their robots and trying to get the Ri3D going. So yeah, that's what all the background noise is about. But yeah, I see your drivetrain over here. Did you want to explain anything about it or like how it works?
Recording in progress.
Dude.
And it's a real drivetrain, but I don't have someone.
Gotcha. Nice. That's cool. Yeah, one of the, I noticed they have 6 wheels on the drivetrain as well. I definitely think it would be very beneficial to teams if they design their robots in a way that they can hop over the PVC pipe in the middle of the field, right? I definitely think if you want to decrease your cycle time so you cycle these game elements faster, you should be able to drive essentially over that PVC pipe. And one way to do that is to have that middle wheel that helps you, pop over the PVC pipe.
Especially since it's not double zoning until you're in the 2 robots are in the other zone and one of them is not touching the middle barrier.
Nice. Yeah. So
both of them are not touching the middle barrier. Sorry.
So it's great to see the progress you've made on your robot, and yeah, hopefully, we want to. We'll meet again tomorrow at 6 p.m. PST from 6 to 7. So feel free to join us again tomorrow at the same time. And yeah, we will continue to update you guys on how our Ri3D robot goes, and also give the platform for you guys to share your robot designs and your questions, just like you have done. So yeah, thank you guys. That's it from us. We're signing off, and yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Guys.